Welcome to this webinar on strategic crisis management in the European Union. My name is Nils Eksalin. I'm a philosopher at Lund University. I'm also a member of Academia Europaea and vice chair of the European Group on Ethics. Next slide, please. Next slide. The title of today's seminar or webinar is Be Prepared. Can we forecast the next crisis and be ready to manage it? And you and I, we wake up in the morning and look at the newspapers, and today I feel I'm just reading about crises around the world. We have a financial crisis spreading. We have a climate crisis which has been with us for many, many years and is serious. We have the terrible war in Ukraine, and we have just came out, we hope, from a pandemic. And what I've been told, or what we learned recently, is that current crises are transboundary. They are in the sense that they cut across geographical borders. We saw that during COVID. They cut across fields of practice and policy and fields of expertise, and we will see that today. Current crises are often nested, the researchers says, and they often have a cascading impact. They spread into society in many, many different ways, and there are many interconnections and causal links to be looked at. Some of the questions we're going to look at today is how do we understand the nature of the risks that we are facing, and how do we manage them? And what are important, how do we build trust across our communities and societies? We know from the COVID that this is important. And how do we maybe create effective communication, which was also very important during COVID, but we did not always succeed. A lot of questions, and some of them have been discussed in 3 recent reports. Can I have the next slide, please? The scientific advice mechanism, SAM, consists of 2 legs or 2 parts. One is SAPEA, which is providing scientific advice for policy making, and of course the group of chief scientific advisors. And they together advise the College of the European Commissioners, and we can have the next slide. And they have done the work, and they have, together with the European Group of Ethics, written 3 reports, statements, or opinions. And the group of chief scientific advisors have then published this opinion, Strategic Crisis Management in the EU, Improving EU Crisis Prevention, Preparedness, Response, and Resilience. The European Group of Ethics in Science and New Technologies, we published our statement, Values in Times of Crisis. And SAPEA did a huge job publishing a comprehensive evidence review report. I can strongly recommend that you look at these reports, read them, they are each and every one I find interesting. But together they are doing something which I don't think has been done so often. Together they look at both the science we have, the scientific basis for policy making, but also at all the ethical questions that are present, and the value questions that we need to discuss and deal with. Next slide, please. And here you have the 3 reports. And next slide. And the format of today's webinar is that we have 4 excellent, well-known panelists, and they are going to speak for 5 minutes each. And after that, there will be time for questions and answers. Our first panelist is Professor Maja Brusma, who is Professor of Biorobotics and Vice Rector for Research at Tallinn University of Technology. Professor Ortmund Gren, who was a member or is a member of SAPEA Working Group on Strategic Crisis Management in the EU. Professor Enrico Sio, from Center for Research on Risk and Crisis, École Demain in Paris, and also a member of SAPEA's Working Group on Strategic Crisis Management. And finally, we have Professor Virginia Murray, Head of Global Disaster Risk Reduction, UK Health Security Agency. And as I said, they have 5 minutes each, and after that there is time for questions and answers. And please use the Q&A to post concise questions to our panelists, and I will read your questions to them, and there will be a discussion. It is important to know that this webinar will be recorded and made available after the event. We will go on for about an hour, and a little bit depending on how many questions there are. But let's start. Welcome again. I'm very happy to chair this. And our first speaker is Maja, and I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Nils-Erik, and good afternoon to all the participants on the seminar. Crisis is a daunting topic, but as a chief scientific advisor, I have to admit that it's been very intellectually rewarding for me to work with the best experts in the world and in Europe, such as Enrico, Ortwin, and Virginia, who know so much about that topic. And as a chief scientific advisor, of course, I have a great belief in scientific knowledge and in the scientific method, and believes that if we approach problems scientifically, then we can solve them. And I deeply enjoyed that the expert in crisis management were talking in abstract terms like a general crisis and how to resolve the general crisis. That was also a topic of today's seminar. Can we predict the next crisis? And if somebody asks me as a chief scientific advisor, can we predict the next crisis? I would say no, we cannot predict the next crisis. But what we know from the previous experience is that many crises have something in common. They have general features, they're generalizable. And even if the previous crisis was different for the new one, there is definitely something that we can learn. There are lessons given by pandemics we can use for an energy crisis, for example, and something from an energy crisis we can use for migration crisis, and so on and so on. And one thing that the experts have been emphasizing throughout this exercise of giving scientific advice is that, unfortunately, we spend too little time pondering about what could we have possibly learned from the previous crisis. And that's also the reason why we have the seminar, to make everybody to understand that we actually have a huge body of knowledge, which is somewhat unused. I remember my first experience with experts like Ortwin and Enrico on a seminar, and I remember also kind of a feeling of frustration. Some of you came out and said, but this is what we've been talking for years and nobody listens to us. And I said, yes, please, but let's talk one more time. And let's do our best that people are going to listen to that. So if somebody would ask me to summarize in only one sentence what the scientific advice for the European Commission is about, that one sentence would be very general again, but would be that the nature of crisis is changing. And therefore, the way we manage a crisis has to change too. How is it changing? Niels Ehring was saying a little bit already, said we have cascading, compound, transboundary reflex, but why is it so? Because experts are saying that our world is becoming more complex. And somebody who's, for example, has a great knowledge of history, or, we're coming from third world countries, or even me, I grew up in the Soviet Union, and I remember one bad situation after another, and I'm asking, wasn't the world like that before, like this? But the answer is actually no, it's a little bit different, and you know what? It's becoming more complex, and one of the reasons it's becoming more complex is the technology. From 50 years' time, the technology has been advancing. And what does it mean? It means that we have so much more connections between different people, agents, authorities, players, stakeholders in the world. And all the effects we have just spread so fast, they never did before. And therefore, we have to be ready for a world where crises are spreading much faster. We have a complex world, much more complex world. And in a complex world, we need to have different ways of managing the crisis. And I know Ortwin have a lot to say about complexity. He's an expert of complexity. So I would rather give word over to him to explain exactly what does he mean about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Maya, you did an excellent job giving the floor to Ortwin. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Niels Ehring. Thank you very much also, Maria, for explaining already the term complexity. And I would like to emphasize that complex systems are the ones that really make us most of the headaches. If things are simple, I think we're very well in the crisis management mode. We know how to deal with earthquakes and with a lot of other natural hazards, but also technological hazards. But if things are complex and intertwined, then we have a lot of problems. And complexity basically means that we have a complex or a very sophisticated web of causes, moderators, amplifiers, and consequences, and that we don't have a very clear picture of how all of these interact. We do have models about them, but the picture is not clear enough to make sure that we understand all the causal and functional relationships between the many variables that are influential. And the reason for that is that, and now you made that very clear, is firstly because things are just getting more interconnected. Everything somehow is connected with everything else. That's also true for the technology, because through the web, and as we just using it right now, we can communicate over the whole globe, which is great. But at the same time, it shows the vulnerabilities, because if one area is vulnerable, everything else is also vulnerable. So given the report, the crisis management report that we have authorized, I would like to draw three major conclusions out of this. And I think those are the three that I would like to highlight today. The first one is modern complex crises are transboundary and transgressional and transsectoral. And that means we need multiple agencies and multiple actors to work together. That includes that we have to be multi and even interdisciplinary, because one discipline cannot grasp all the consequences of one crisis. Secondly, we need to be transsectoral, and that's even more difficult because all our crisis management agencies are normally aligned to one sector. So we have a Ministry of the Interior, a Ministry of Social Affairs, a Ministry of Health, and what we can see is they don't really interact well with each other. They're very good in managing a crisis within their own realm of expertise, but they are very bad in cooperating with others. Everybody works in his or her own silo. And that's one of the major problems that we face. Just the example of COVID is very good. As long as COVID was only a health issue, I think we did very well in Europe. I mean, actually, we were very good in using, our expertise. However, as soon as it came clear we have other kinds of risks and other kind of negative consequences in terms of education, in terms of business, in terms of domestic violence, in terms of a whole set of social and also environmental issues, the management was not that great anymore, because then we needed to interact with each of these ministries, interact with each of these agencies, and then everybody had its own egoism, its own agenda, and then it became much less effective. My second point is that if you want to manage well, we need to have a multidimensional value or criteria system. Very often in ordinary crisis, it was just reduce one thing, reduce the health risks, or reduce the environmental risks, or reduce the possibility that technology fails. At this point, we can find out that such a unidirectional or unidimensional approach is not appropriate anymore. And again, COVID could be a good example, just to reduce the amount of people that are being affected is a very important indicator, perhaps the most important, but not the only one. We had to look at many other indicators. And so it is very important that we can see, is our policy effective also among different constituencies? Is it very efficient in terms of the resources that we use? Is it resilient in terms of that it really covers different crises at the same time and stresses? And is it socially just? And that's something that I think is also very important. Very often we have management methods that do save the rich, but not the poor. And that, is easily said, very difficult to deal with it, because the poor are often more vulnerable. They often don't have the capacity to help themselves. And thirdly, if something happens, they're the first ones who will be affected. So we need to be multidimensional, and social justice is one of the main dimensions that we need to take into account from the beginning. And my last point is that I think our risk management needs to be inclusive. Inclusive means it's not just the experts or not just the contingency or emergency managers that need to be consulted. We also need to consult with the major players in society. That's not only a nice democratic rule that we want to obey to, but basically it's also functional, because with a lot of complex crises, if we don't know all the factors that are involved, we need a lot of experiential knowledge. People who have experience can help us to deal with things where our systematic knowledge still lacks understanding. And this experiential knowledge, also local knowledge, is extremely important to be very effective, but also to be resilient in crisis. And so my third thing is we need to find good ways to be inclusive. Now, it's very clear that if we are in the middle of a crisis, we cannot make a big citizen assembly or a big round table and then discuss what to do, because we need to act very promptly. However, before a crisis strikes, we can do that. We can try to get those people together to move well in terms of preparing a very good, inclusive and effective emergency and contingency plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Otwin. And we go on to Enrico.
Good afternoon, good night, good morning, ladies and gentlemen around the globe. I'm very pleased of this opportunity. I think we need very many opportunities of exchange on this topic that affects all of us. I have been learning relatively recently that our period, our era, is termed by some as the perma-crisis era, where we're permanently under crisis. Now, the crisis that we're experiencing today during the webinar is due to the cascading effect of the fact that I, on the end of the course party with my students, and to bribe me, they brought the so-called Italian boss liquor, and they made me drink some of this. So this could be with significant consequences. Now, that said, if you allow me, I'd like to share some slides for the topic today, because the topic of today is challenging. And we're talking about being prepared, forecasting, being ready, and managing, nothing less than that, okay? And now some of the things that I will say today are in fact a very synthetic view of what is contained in the Strategic Crisis Management Evidence Report, which I had the pleasure, I think as Maria was saying, to contribute to with the outstanding colleagues of great expertise, multidisciplinary as needed, just like the expertise and the experts that are currently giving this webinar, except for me. Now, the key point here, and I'm trying to close this, let me see if I close, okay. The key point here that I'm going to be addressing is the aspect of, strategic management, crisis management, with respect to the points of being prepared, forecast, be ready, and manage, where, you actually are trying to manage what I call a big kid. Knowledge, information, and data. Big data is a buzzword everybody's using, and everybody is, I would say, is riding the wave of big data. We have much more than that. It's big kid, and it's really a management issue of collecting the data, knowledge, and information, which comes from signals, images, text, which are synthesizing the knowledge around the world about the crisis indicators. From that big kid, knowledge, information, and data, we need to extract what's useful to do strategic foresight, situational making, and awareness in order to be prepared, forecast, be ready, and feed the proper decision making that is needed for managing crisis. Now, this goes through the actual, I would say, crisis development. This needs to be done. We need to inform our decision making with all the knowledge available, with all the information available, with all the data available before, as Professor Ram was saying just now, to prepare in order to manage the crisis, and after, in order to recover from the crisis. Be prepared, forecast, be ready, manage. Easy and very rational to say, okay? Now, before the crisis, we're talking about prevention and preparedness. Safety and security risk assessments, which are made in a sense offline, okay, are the ones that drive us to decide on what protections we need in terms of safety and security barriers to prevent and prepare or mitigate the consequences of crisis. But at the same time, we need to keep scanning what's going on to a number of indicators that might indicate to us some changes in trends of behaviors, trends of processes, let them be social, environmental, systemic, industrial, call them whatever they are, that are changing the situation and are detecting some new situation, some anomalies, okay? Now, preparedness before means being able to put all the knowledge we have, information that we have, to do strategic foresight. That's the crystal ball, but it's a smart, it's an informed crystal ball where we're trying to depict possible future scenarios. What is the big challenge here? Because on these future scenarios, we will be making the strategic decision-making on how to protect, how to prepare, and how to prevent. Now, the challenge there is the completeness and the representativeness of the scenario considered. These things are not new and shocking in a sense. If you look at the works done on performance assessment of radioactive waste repositories, that's one issue, okay? Trying to make sure that you're considered in the long years, and we're talking about thousands of years with respect to radioactive waste repositories, okay? That you need to consider what could happen, okay? Thousands of years. And the completeness and representativism, in a sense, is decided by, is that enough to take today based on what I know, based on the information I have, based on the data I have, and the future scenario that I can foresee, is that enough to take confident decision-making? Then my foresight is complete and representative. Again, safety and security risk assessment, because they're going to support the decision-making to prepare. Logistic and supply planning, masks, protection, individual protections, supply chain on anything that you can think of resources, let them be medical, let them be rare earths, let them be electronic parts, whatever that is that could cause a and then, ladies and gentlemen, our systems are not just physical, are not just cyber physical. There's also the fundamental human component. And as Professor Ram was saying, to be resilient, the human part is fundamental. We'll come back to that in a minute. So training is fundamental to increase the preparedness, but not just of the professional that need to intervene during a crisis, the civil protection, firefighters, whoever they are, but also the policymakers.
Oh, you don't have many minutes. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you said we will be back in a minute to that in a minute. You don't have many minutes.
Okay, I'll be real quick then.
Okay.
And then, the challenge is there's a lot of training tools, lots have been augmented by digital twins, gaming, and virtual reality and augmented reality. But we need to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of this and build curricula for this effective training. Now, during and after the crisis, there is then a need for knowledge, information, and data sharing on cross-border transnational crisis, okay, to be able to make sense of the situation and do a dynamic safety and security risk assessment that leads us to decisions which are robust for confidence. And I'll let you read through the slide. This is again easy to say, but there's things that need to be done. On the data sharing, we need to have a data governance way to make sure that the data are trustworthily transmitted, the communication are reliable, that they are harmonized, that the data are protected from privacy, and from the information point of view, okay, we need to make sure sufficient information, also through the social media sharing, but they need to be protected from disinformation. Risk communication must build trust in the official communication information. Otherwise, the public will not follow it. And promoting resilience of ethics and ethics of resilience is fundamental. Finally, the knowledge. There's a lot of expertise. There's a lot of knowledge, scientific, technical, and political. We need to we come back to this. These are the elements. I'm sorry to go too long. These are the elements, sorry, that are needed to build this effective paradigm and procedure. Sorry for that.
Okay, thank you very much. So our final panelist is Virginia. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. If I could share my screen, that would be lovely. It is a real privilege to be here and to be talking with you. It's a real opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing and how much we mind about all the engagement that you've given us in trying to build this incredible piece of work that you've been doing, in trying to make sure that we can see how it works. I'm just going to go to my task. Okay, it's only a part screen, but I hope you can see it enough. So I'm really honored to be here, and it's a great opportunity to bring in some of the thoughts that we have. What we do know is that we're really anxious that we can share with you some of the information that sits inside WHO with the international health regulations and all the commitments to the work that have been going on about how we were able to deal with some of the transboundary issues that Niels, Eric and Ortwin and even Enrico have been talking about, as well as Marja. These are really important to us, and this is the latest update from the World Health Organization. And it's by using this as a global effort, we've been able to try and understand some of the impacts of COVID-19. But it's not just that. You mentioned that there are so many other issues. So going back to your incredible documents, which I thought were really tremendously valuable, we needed to also share with you the fact that COVID-19 pandemic not only has been a major global shock and has exposed a lack of preparedness, it was a health crisis that brought on those larger social and economic crises, as you mentioned. We know that cascading multi-hazard systemic failure risks can rapidly affect large areas and multiple sectors. And although you've looked in Europe, we know it's a worldwide issue. And of course, for that, we then need international standards that bring together a more harmonized, comparable data that, amongst other things, support the indicators for the Sendai targets. And this all comes, of course, from the scientific opinion in the strategic crisis management. So looking at this further, I thought it would be important to go back to the Sendai framework and reflect that there are many things that have come from that, including the all hazards need. And that has been really important. So the first report that we did on this was published in July 2020, and I've had the great privilege to be the chair of the technical working group for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the International Science Council. But they didn't just want a technical report. They wanted something else, which I think is really important, which is this, which are the hazard information profiles, which tries to define exactly what these hazards are and to look at all the complex hazards that you've been talking about. So we've summarized it in 8 clusters, which include hydromet, extraterrestrial, geohazards, environmental, chemical, biological hazards, technological, and although not part of the Sendai framework, all those societal hazards which relate, Niels Erik, to those ones that you've been concerned about conflict and violence, domestic violence and other issues that became such issues during COVID. And it's that building of the trust that we've tried to make a more complete hazard set of data, which we think is going to be very important for the future. So to share this further, I just wanted to show you that we have now know that these fit with the Sendai framework, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, because what we've done is to provide a common set of hazard definitions for monitoring and reviewing implementation, but also help us to move forward to look how we would deal with early warning systems and early action, which is being called for globally now with Antonio Guterres' appeal from March 2022, and there's a huge global program of work on this. So really important that we look to work not only from your wonderful European community work on how to be prepared and forecasting the next crisis, we need to bring that together to try and make sure that we can provide things that I think will be really important to develop shared international and national processes for the times of crisis. And I think your papers, including the wonderful ethical paper on trust and other work, are absolutely critical for this. But we also need to think about how we can invest in the development of strategic crisis management, data support systems, infrastructure, and tools, such as using these international tools that might help us, like the UNDRR and International Science Council hazard information profiles. By having all these together and supporting that incredibly important message about training and exercising, we can develop a strategic crisis management and expertise to address these crisis situations more easily. But we must do it in partnership, in collaboration. And the privilege of joining you for this webinar is enormous. I thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. And we have a number of questions, but I can't resist, if you excuse me, to ask a question. And one thing that really worries me is that I'm brought up that we can always take rational decisions. We have tools and methods for doing it, and philosophers, economists have, and others have developed theories for rational decision-making. And Ortwin knows where I'm heading. And we are sort of slowly learning. We have learned recently, or around the millennium, that when we have huge amount of uncertainties, as we often have when there is a crisis, and we are in a situation of greater value uncertainty, we can't use the traditional methods for taking decisions. So we have to find some other ways to do it. And my question to you, are we still talking about this, thinking that we can maximize expected utility or something else when we need something completely different? And my question is, what is this? How do we take decisions in a crisis? And as I think it was Ortwin who said, that it will change, constantly change. Do we need new decision rules or whatever? It's a long question, I'm sorry, but I think this is a problem. It's a crisis of crises. Ortwin.
Yeah, I'm happy to be the first one, but I think everyone has to say something about it. I think you're absolutely right, Niels Erik, that the classic way of maximizing the net benefit of expectations may not be the best guidance for a good decision. First, we have a lot of uncertainties, but we also have a lot of ambiguities because some things are good for some, but bad for others. And that makes it very difficult because we have to also think about the distributive effects of things. So there's another way that, or another thing that makes it even more complex. My feeling is that very often the good thing about human decisions is that we can make decisions in time. I mean, that's also one of the advantages compared to all these artificial intelligence. They can give answers faster than we give questions. And they are fast, but they're very often too fast. So I think one of the things that we can do is to say, we can do things like containing questions. So saying, okay, we start with something and we observe whether it works or not works. We can, secondly, we can say, okay, we do not want to optimize things, or we just make sure that we minimize the post-decision regret. Again, the maximum or mini-max principle, whatever we want to call it. And finally, I think what's really important is, when I thought about an inclusive approach, is to see how people deal with the consequences of things. And sometimes we have an early monitoring system that helps us to see when things develop differently from what we had expected. So I think start locally, start step by step, not having the grand solution for everything at once. Observe what you're doing and monitor what it is, and don't expect specifically, if you do one-dimensional optimization, that the maximum that you can get is also the optimum.
Okay, I think I move. Thank you very much. I move on to the questions I have in the question and answer. And we have here one which asks, to what extent do the panelists think that the complexity we are seeing in modern crises are effectively treated by or made worse by national and international the national or international institutions we have? Who wants to say something about that, because it's an important question?
Well, if I may, I mean, and I'm not sure if I got the question completely, Enrico. I think that given the nature of these crises, which are typically cross-border and transnational, we do need national institutions to deal with complexity on one side and to handle the, protected and trustable transition and transmission of all the knowledge, information, and data which is needed to handle them. So I think that there is a trend to try to be able to manage these crises at an international level. And it's more and more needed. There are, of course, some holdbacks, maybe cultural, because we have always thought about, we've been grown up and developed as nations, and now we, of course, are unions more and more around the world, and we are a global world. And the more we are able to share knowledge, information, and data on these crises, the more we will be able to deal with the complexity of it. That's necessary.
Someone else? Reflection? Maya?
Yes, thank you. I have more general question, reflection to two other questions as well here. One asking about was a complexity is just an excuse for inaction. I like that question very much. So yeah. Thank you for asking such a good questions, because I've also been thinking about that a lot. And the thing with, this coordination and going around an international organization and changing information and talking to each other would, in a worst case, lead to inaction or pulverized responsibility. Because, in a complex world, it's very hard to say that what is your part, your little furrow here where you're taking a responsibility of doing things, because, everything is connected to everything and you just can't act on anything. But I think a complex system is not actually such a bad thing as it sounds, because complex system in effect is very amazing. It has properties of self-organization, and if you partition the complex system well enough so that you allow a certain degree of autonomy in all of the parts, and certain responsibility, you may actually come up with a system where you can take decisions fast, where people are responsible for decisions, but there's still enough interaction so that, people calibrate with each other and coordinate with each other, change information, and kind of, the whole complex system settles into, not an optimum, which is probably hard to find, but something which is suboptimal. And there was another question asking also about, this coordination between states and choices to make, and one state can have a different choice that the other state can make. And I think actually this is a good thing, that they can make different decisions, so that you have this variability of a response in a complex system. If everybody would respond exactly in the same way, there is a risk that everybody's responding in the wrong way. Whereas when you allow a certain variability of response, first of all, you're tuning in for the local conditions where are exactly best for that region, for example, or a member state, but also you have a chance to compare the different responses and learn for each other. And that's also a characteristic to complex systems, that you can adapt and you can learn. So long story short, I think complexity is not that bad thing after all. It also had very nice properties.
Mm-hmm. And I will pick something from the question and answers to you. There's a question about the political influence here. How do we deal with these political issues in practice in coming crisis, in view of the instance inclusive crisis management? How do we deal with political influence? During the COVID, it can be good, it can be bad, but during the COVID, we saw that the European states did very different things. And in some cases, as in Sweden, the politicians are not allowed to interfere with the agencies and tell them what to do. In other countries in Europe, they went in and decided how to close down or not close down. How do we do in the future? How should we deal with politics and science and ethics? That's the question, isn't it? Virginia, I think it's your question.
Well, I don't think it's just mine, but I think it's one that is very much could be answered by all the panelists. My reflection is, Niels Erik, that if we're going to look at how we can engage across the world, and we look at transboundary issues, and that we deal with these things reflecting the national and local needs of these events, then it's very important that we understand the limitations of what we have. So, for instance, with the COVID-19, not every country followed the same definition of what a COVID-related death might be. And it certainly had a lot of discussion in our Houses of Parliament to consider these issues. And we know that a lot of other countries have different ways of documenting death from a COVID-19 exposure to some of the ones that have been recommended by WHO and other countries. But what we do is to pick up, Marja, your message that we have to reflect the cultural and local needs of the communities that we serve, But by having common definitions for some of these things, then we manage to make it slightly easier for us all to communicate and share together. So I think this is one of the advantages of the hazard definitions that we have, is that we have a common definition and we can share together what we need to either be ready for in a new crisis or what we can plan to work with to try and make sure that we can manage it better, because we can talk similar language between countries and across countries and deal with transboundary issues more easily. Of course, the complexity of the COVID-19 event, which is still with us, it's not closed as a pandemic, it's still there because there's still so many concerns, is that it really is looking at not only the health impacts, but it's also the impacts on economies and education and all the other issues that were so clearly documented. And that the fact that other crises have come in, just as you've been describing, Enrico, the idea of a perma-crisis or poly-crisis that you certainly have talked about before, Ortwin, pulling these together are increasingly important, that we can share this data in a way that we can all use and work together. So it is a collaboration which requires certainly local and national organizations to be involved, and regional, just as you brought together all the work that you pull together with the strategic crisis management and the idea of pulling together the advice to governments, but also to try and make sure that we deliver this in a way, not only just in Europe, but more widely across the world, so that we can all communicate, because we never know quite where something will start from or will occur from. And I think that's very important to be aware of. Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wants to add something? No? I have another question here, and that is that you are all focusing on the scientific things very much. And when we talk about the member states in the European Union or the states in Europe, we can have very, very different ways of approaching ethical problems. We don't share the same values always. And this can become a serious problem. And again, we saw it clearly during the COVID, that we didn't agree about what was important, how we should prioritize, etc. You know all this better than I do. But how do we solve serious value conflicts during a crisis? And especially, is this problem more serious and more difficult to handle if we have these cascading effects that we have, and also we have many crises at the same time? I would, is there anyone of you who wants to say something about it?
Yeah, I can maybe start with this, Niels Erik. I think that's a very pertinent question. And my general feeling is that scientists should have the duty to provide political options for action, not the answer. So you can give options. And then it's up to the political decision makers to do the trade-offs. And they may be different. There may be countries that put human health in the absolute priority. Others may say, no, economy is so important for us, we put this as a specific priority. I think what's extremely important is that scientists and also journalists make sure that everybody understands these trade-offs, that we are absolutely transparent about it, and we are not lying to ourselves. And that unfortunately happens very often in the political arena, that people say, oh, we do everything at the same time. We're going to do, we maximize health, we maximize economics, we maximize education. That's not possible. I mean, we cannot do that. And I think it's very clear that we make that, in very good understandable terms to everyone interested, that we say, okay, there are trade-offs. And if you say, I want to save as many lives as possible, we will sacrifice something else, not just money. We may sacrifice education, we may sacrifice a lot of young corporations and whatsoever. So in that sense, it's very important. And now I think at the same time as political citizens, we should also try to make sure that there's a democratic process how to make these trade-offs. And democratic is not just majority vote. I mean, that's something that a lot of authoritarian systems right now think is just majority vote. No, democracy means also that minorities are being heard, that we have check and balances in place. So all of that belongs to it. And I don't want to go much too into it because it could continue forever. The basic issue is, I think as scientists, we have to make sure those are the options, those are the consequences, and be sure that if you do A, you sacrifice B. Then it's a political process, how these trade-offs are being made. And as citizens, I think we should also make a lot of effort, even with our status as scientists, to say, we want this to be done in a very democratic way.
Maya and Enrico, do you want to add something about value questions?
Maybe I can add my view. I mean, ethics of behavior, in particular during crisis, ethics of resilience, it's a probably long cultural and educational process, which is very much needed at a transnational level. And I think it is the foundation on which political decisions, trustable political decisions can be made, informed by science. So I sort of like combined your previous question. I mean, I see this virtuous loop where a community, global, or if you want to restrict it to European Union, a European ethical base of values upon which political decisions need to guide the development of our societies and the responses to the preparedness and responses to crisis, scientifically informed, not scientifically decided, scientifically informed. We need to work for this. It's not I would say, an invasion of powers that a lot of people are worried about. It's really a sharing for protection, defense, and well-being of everyone.
Maya, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just said when we were writing the scientific opinions and we decided that we kind of take for granted that whatever we recommend we will come from the European values. And we do not give any other advice to the policymakers that, something that considers the European values. But coming to Ortwin's answer, I would like to add here that sometimes what we could do better in crisis management is that we understand better which are the vulnerable groups exactly that could get hit during the crisis. For example, because when we consider solidarity or inclusiveness or something else, and it's important that those vulnerable groups could vary from one crisis to another. It's sometimes in the places where you don't kind of, it's in your first thought is not that this is a vulnerable group. For example, when you take COVID, well, at least we, Estonia, didn't think first that teachers could be vulnerable, but, giving what kind of psychological pressures they were going through, so actually frontline workers. Or if you take, for example, heat waves, everybody understands that old people are very vulnerable in heat waves, but what is the other group? Young males who are working outdoors. And they're not thinking about themselves either as being vulnerable. So I think, to have this kind of a flexibility of understand who gets hit with that particular crisis could be something that decision makers can do better.
You want to add something, Virginia?
Yes, I should love to, if I may.
Yeah.
To me, I think you've raised some really important points. The message that we've got from all the work that you've been leading on the ethics side is really useful. But I just wanted to share with you the UNESCO recommendations on open science, which is another international framework that's come through, which talks a lot about trust and principles. And we're now beginning to work much more with partners, including UNESCO and others, looking at data policy in times of crisis and what the principles might be there. So I think what we have is lots of different mechanisms to try and pull these different networks together that I think will make it very rich. And that is part of why we need to look at those vulnerabilities that you've so clearly suggested as a real area of import. And I think by bringing these together, we can enrich how we work globally, not just with the incredible knowledge that happens inside Europe, but to expand their knowledge from the incredible work you have been doing. And I think that's a really rich partnership that might be very helpful to move further forward on.
Here's another question. It's a short question, but could predictions, it disappeared? It disappeared when I read it. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. What?
I did answer it on the, I'm trying to answer some of the questions already
so you are
online, and that if you look at the answers, then you can see that I didn't already answer that question, and the question is still on, but it disappears from the question.
Here's another one then. What happens when scientific advice seems to differ across different countries? We touched up on that, but this is also connecting. I can add something to that question because Virginia, you emphasize training. And the question is, what sort of training is it that we want? Is it, and you can hear that I'm from the European Group of Ethics, but is it scientific training, or is it also ethical training that you, or what do you mean by fostering training here? It's utterly important. I agree, fully agree, but I would like to hear some more about it.
I think without a doubt, Niels-Erik, the idea of ethical training is something that is becoming into more curricula these days, certainly than when I initially started in my medical career. And I think that's really vital, that we bring in the ethics much more into what we do. And I think that's fantastic that the paper that you've been preparing has made such an impact. But most of us are scientists, and we've been brought up in the very direct scientific domains. And what we are learning to do with many of the new systems that are coming through that Enrico was talking about, of virtual reality and other things, is to try and make sure we understand that we can bring our scientific training into this wider domain, understanding all these different things, so long as we bring ethics and governance into everything we do. I am so grateful to you for picking this up. Thank you very much, Niels-Erik.
Virginia, I completely agree, if I may jump in. I mean, diverse, scientific advices and views are a richness, and a unifying assessment and reflection on the different views could only lead to a better decision making for the whole. So I think that's what's needed.
Do we always, do we have time to reflect? And sometimes the crisis seems to be of a kind that we need to act here and now, rather than sit down and think. COVID was very much here and now. And what do you think about?
Quick thinking in that way. I mean, you definitely, you got to compromise between, how long you can wait for reflections, data, information to take the decision, and then it's too late. So it's a clear balance that you need to do. But I think that the scientific experts and the political responsible people are well aware of that, and then can manage that within the time frame that's needed for the reaction. I'm very positive and optimistic, but we need to start these kinds of mechanisms. That's fundamental. That's what SAPER is trying to do, and in a sense, propose, if I can say that. It's really necessary. It's really necessary.
And I would also like to emphasize the pre-crisis preparedness. I think, if you wait until the crisis strikes, then of course it may be too late. But if you have very good preparatory work in front of the crisis before it happens, it matters what happens, as they all have similar patterns. I mean, Virginia just made that point very clearly. And then it is much easier than in the crisis, if you have a lack of time, you know what to do because we have exercised it before.
Yeah, 90% of the decisions have already been taken. I mean, or can they already be taken based on preparedness? I completely agree.
I think this is a wonderful final message. Be prepared. Think about the scientific questions and the value questions ahead of before something happens. Then you are much, much better prepared. I think we are on the clock, and I thank you all for your presentations and your comments. Thank you very much. And I thank those who have asked questions. So goodbye. And thank you.
Thank you very much for managing the session. Thank you very much. And thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.